They looked at me like I was just an old woman holding a set of keys. What they never realized was that those keys opened the door to everything they thought they controlled. My name is Evelyn Harper, and for most of my life, I never cared about proving anything to anyone. I believed that a person's character was shown through kindness, not through what they owned. After my husband passed away, I spent years learning how to live a quieter life. The house we built together in a peaceful neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio, became more than just a property. It was a place filled with memories, laughter, and decades of our lives together. Every corner reminded me of the family we created and the dreams we once shared. But as the years passed, I knew I had to make practical decisions. Maintaining a large home alone was not easy, especially after my husband was gone. I decided to rent the house to someone who would appreciate it and treat it with care. I was not looking for someone to simply send me a monthly payment. I wanted someone who respected the meaning behind the place. That was when I met Michael and Laura Bennett. When they first came to see the house, they seemed like the perfect tenants. They were polite, well-spoken, and appeared grateful for the opportunity. Laura complimented the garden my husband had planted years earlier. Michael talked about how much they wanted a stable home where they could settle down. They told me they loved the feeling of the house. They said it felt warm and welcoming. Hearing those words made me hopeful. I thought perhaps this was exactly what I had been waiting for. A family who would care for the home as much as I had. During our first meeting, I did not tell them everything about myself. I simply introduced myself as Evelyn, a retired woman who wanted to rent out her property. I never mentioned the full history of the house. I never talked about the other investments my husband and I had made over the years. I never explained that this home was not just an ordinary rental property. I did not hide the truth because I wanted to deceive them. I simply believed that a person's behavior should not change based on what they think someone owns. I wanted to see who they truly were. At first, everything seemed normal. They moved in and thanked me repeatedly. They told me they felt lucky to have found such a beautiful home. But slowly, I began noticing small changes. Their conversations became less warm. Their requests became more frequent. Instead of asking, they started speaking as if they were entitled to certain things. I tried to be understanding. I reminded myself that everyone has different personalities and different ways of communicating. I did not want to judge too quickly. After all, I had lived long enough to know that first impressions do not always tell the whole story. Then came the conversation that made me realize something important. Michael and Laura invited me over to discuss the rental agreement. They sat across from me with a confidence that surprised me. They explained that they believed the house was worth less than the original amount we discussed. They said they thought paying $800 a month would be more reasonable. I listened quietly as they explained their reasons. They spoke as if they were doing me a favor. They spoke as if I was someone who would not understand the value of my own property. I looked around the room and remembered all the years my husband and I spent building a life there. I thought about the memories behind those walls. But I did not argue. I did not become angry. I simply smiled and said I would think about it. They had no idea who they were speaking to. They did not know the full story of the woman sitting in front of them. They saw my gray hair and quiet personality, and they made assumptions. What they did not understand was that silence does not mean weakness. Sometimes, the person saying the least is the person who knows the most. And that was the moment I decided to pay closer attention to everything that happened next. After that conversation about the rent, I went home and sat quietly in the kitchen where my husband and I had shared so many meals together. I looked around the room and thought about how easily people can misunderstand what they see. Michael and Laura had looked at me and decided they knew exactly who I was. To them, I was simply an older woman who owned a house and probably wanted to avoid conflict. They did not see the years of hard work behind that home. They did not see the memories, the sacrifices, or the careful decisions that allowed me to keep everything I had built. But I was not offended because they underestimated my finances. What bothered me was something deeper. They underestimated me as a person. Over the years, I had learned that money reveals a lot about people. It does not always change someone's character, but it often reveals what is already there. When people think you have nothing to offer, they sometimes show a side of themselves they would normally hide. I wanted to believe Michael and Laura were simply unaware. I wanted to believe they were not intentionally disrespectful. So instead of reacting emotionally, I decided to observe. I agreed to continue discussing the rental arrangement because I wanted to understand their intentions. I told them I would consider their request for the $800 monthly rent. They seemed pleased. They thanked me and acted as though they had successfully negotiated with someone who did not know better. I noticed the confidence in their voices. They believed the conversation was finished. They believed they had gained control of the situation. What they did not know was that I was not making a decision based only on the number they offered. I was paying attention to how they treated me during the process. A home is not just four walls and a roof. A home represents trust between the person providing the space and the person living there. I wanted tenants who understood respect mattered more than a discount. Over the next few weeks, I visited the property occasionally. I always gave proper notice because I respected their privacy. Each time I came by, I noticed small things. They were taking good care of the house, which I appreciated. The garden was still maintained, and the rooms were kept clean. But their attitude toward me continued to change. Conversations that once felt friendly became more businesslike. They started speaking to me as if I was an inconvenience rather than the person who had given them an opportunity. One afternoon, Michael mentioned that he thought some improvements should be made to the property. He spoke confidently, listing changes he believed were necessary. I listened carefully. Some of his suggestions were reasonable, and I appreciated his ideas. But then he said something that caught my attention. He said, "You should really trust people who know more about these things." He did not say it in an openly rude way. He said it casually, almost as if it was a harmless comment. But I understood what he meant. He assumed that because I was older, I could not understand decisions about my own property. I simply smiled and thanked him for sharing his thoughts. I did not explain my experience. I did not tell him that I had managed properties for years with my husband. I did not tell him that I understood far more than he imagined. There was no reason to prove myself to someone who had already made up his mind. That evening, I called my attorney, someone who had helped my husband and me manage our affairs for many years. I told him about the situation, and he was not surprised. He reminded me that appearances often cause people to make mistakes. He asked what I wanted to do. I told him I was not interested in embarrassing anyone or creating unnecessary conflict. I simply wanted to make sure everything was handled fairly. That was always who I had been. I believed in calm solutions. I believed in treating people with dignity, even when they did not offer the same in return. But I also knew something important. Being kind does not mean allowing others to take advantage of you. As I looked through the documents connected to the property, I smiled quietly. Michael and Laura still believed they understood the situation. They thought they were negotiating with someone who had little power. They had no idea that the woman they underestimated was the person who held every important decision in her hands. And I was about to discover just how far they were willing to go. The more time I spent observing Michael and Laura, the more I realized that the issue was never really about the $800 rent. The amount itself was not what bothered me. I had lived long enough to know that money could be replaced, but respect was much harder to rebuild once it was lost. What concerned me was the confidence they carried, the belief that they had found someone they could easily influence. They saw my age before they saw my experience. They saw my quiet personality before they saw my wisdom. And that was a mistake they did not even realize they were making. A few days after our conversation, Michael called me again. His tone was friendly, but I could sense that he expected a certain answer. He asked if I had made a decision about the rent. I told him I was still considering everything carefully. There was a pause before he responded. Then he said, "I think you will see that our offer is fair. We are helping you by making this easier." I listened quietly. That sentence told me more than he probably intended. He truly believed he was doing me a favor. He believed I needed him more than he needed me. I thanked him for sharing his thoughts and ended the call politely. Afterward, I sat in my office and opened the old files my husband and I had kept over the years. Inside were documents, records, and memories from the property. I remembered the day we purchased the home decades earlier. We were not wealthy at the time. We worked hard, saved carefully, and made decisions together. That house represented patience and commitment. It represented every sacrifice we made to build a secure future. It was not just an investment. It was part of our story. Looking through those papers reminded me why I had been so careful about choosing the right tenants. I did not need someone who simply occupied the space. I wanted someone who respected what the home represented. Later that week, I met with my attorney again. We reviewed everything related to the property. He reminded me that I had complete control over the decisions because I was the legal owner. I smiled because Michael and Laura had never once asked about the details of my situation. They assumed they already understood everything. My attorney asked me if I wanted to reveal the truth immediately. I thought about it for a moment. Part of me wanted to correct their assumptions. Part of me wanted to tell them that the woman they had been negotiating with was not powerless at all. But another part of me knew that revealing the truth too soon would teach them nothing. Sometimes people only understand their actions when they have enough time to see the consequences of their own assumptions. So I decided to wait. I continued treating them with the same respect I had shown from the beginning. I answered their questions. I listened to their concerns. I remained calm. But I also became more careful. I started keeping detailed records of every conversation and every agreement. It was not because I wanted conflict. It was because experience had taught me the importance of being prepared. One evening, I received a message from Laura. She wanted to discuss some changes they hoped to make to the property. When I arrived, she greeted me warmly, but the conversation quickly shifted. She began explaining what they planned to do as if the decisions had already been made. She talked about the house almost like it belonged to them. I stood there listening as she described their future plans. She had no idea that every word was revealing more about how they viewed me. When she finished, she looked at me and said, "We think this arrangement works well for everyone." I smiled and replied, "I am glad you feel that way." I did not argue. I did not correct her. I simply let the moment pass. Because there was something Michael and Laura did not understand. A person does not need to announce their strength for it to exist. True confidence does not require proving itself. As I drove home that evening, I thought about how differently people behave when they believe they have power. Michael and Laura believed they were controlling the situation. They believed they had negotiated with someone who would accept whatever they offered. They had no idea that every decision they made was bringing them closer to discovering the truth. And when that truth finally came out, they would have to face the fact that they never truly knew the woman they thought they understood. After that evening, I started seeing the situation more clearly. Michael and Laura were not simply trying to negotiate a lower rent. They had created a story in their minds about who I was. They saw an older woman living alone, and they assumed that meant I was easy to convince. They saw my patience as hesitation. They saw my kindness as weakness. But they did not understand something important. The same qualities that made me patient were the qualities that had helped me build a stable life. Being calm did not mean I was unaware. Being polite did not mean I did not notice. For many years, I had learned that the strongest decisions are often made quietly. I did not need to raise my voice to make my point. I did not need to prove my experience to people who had already decided not to see it. I simply needed to let time reveal the truth. A few weeks later, Michael and Laura invited me to another conversation about the property. When I arrived, they had prepared a list of ideas they wanted to discuss. They spoke confidently, almost like business partners making decisions together. They suggested changes to the rental agreement, improvements they wanted to make, and ways they believed the arrangement should work in the future. I listened carefully and asked questions. I wanted to understand their perspective, even though I already knew they were making assumptions. At one point, Laura smiled and said, "We are glad we found you. A lot of landlords would make this process difficult, but you seem very reasonable." I thanked her for the comment. But inside, I noticed something about the way she said it. It sounded less like appreciation and more like relief that they believed they had found someone they could influence. I remembered something my husband used to say whenever we made important decisions. He would always remind me, "Pay attention to how people act when they think no one is watching." Those words stayed with me throughout this experience. Because the truth was, Michael and Laura were showing me exactly who they were. They were not terrible people. They were simply people who had become too comfortable believing they understood my position. They had confused my generosity with a lack of awareness. After the meeting, I returned home and spent some time thinking about what I wanted to do. I could have revealed everything immediately. I could have told them about the value of the property, my years of experience, and the fact that I was not the person they believed me to be. But I decided against it. Not because I wanted to hide forever. I simply wanted the lesson to happen naturally. Sometimes the most powerful moments are not created by what we say. They are created when people discover the truth on their own. During this time, I also began reflecting on why this situation bothered me so much. It was not because someone wanted to pay less rent. It was not because they questioned the value of the house. The real issue was that they looked at me and decided my opinion mattered less because of my age. That feeling was familiar to many people my age. Older adults are often treated as if their experiences no longer have value. People sometimes forget that age brings knowledge, patience, and perspective. A lifetime of experiences cannot be measured by appearance. One morning, I visited the property to check on a few routine matters. As I walked through the rooms, I remembered all the years my husband and I had spent there. I remembered decorating those spaces together. I remembered family gatherings and quiet evenings. I remembered the dreams connected to that home. Michael and Laura saw a rental property. I saw a lifetime of memories. That difference mattered. Before leaving, I noticed a small envelope on the table that contained documents they had requested regarding the property. I picked it up and smiled quietly. They still did not know the complete truth. They still believed they understood the woman standing in front of them. But soon, they would discover that the person they thought they were negotiating with was actually the person who had every right to make the final decision. And when that moment came, I hoped they would learn the lesson I had already understood. Never judge someone's power by how quietly they carry it. The days continued to pass, and I remained patient. I knew that sooner or later, Michael and Laura would discover the truth about the situation. But I did not want the moment to come from anger or embarrassment. I wanted it to come naturally, as a result of the choices they had made. I had spent my entire life believing that people should be given the opportunity to show who they truly are. Sometimes they surprise you in the best ways. Other times, they reveal lessons you never expected to learn. During this time, I continued managing the property the way I always had. I handled responsibilities carefully, kept communication respectful, and made sure everything was documented properly. I did not change my behavior because of their assumptions about me. That was one thing my years of experience had taught me. Other people's opinions do not determine who you are. You determine that through your own actions. One afternoon, Michael contacted me about another discussion regarding the house. He explained that he and Laura wanted to make some adjustments to the arrangement. When I arrived, they seemed more confident than ever. They had prepared several points they wanted to present, and I could tell they believed they were in a position of control. They began explaining why the current agreement should benefit them more. They talked about expenses, convenience, and what they believed was reasonable. I listened without interrupting. I asked questions when necessary. I allowed them to finish everything they wanted to say. When they were done, Michael leaned back and smiled. "We think this is a fair solution for everyone," he said. I looked at him and calmly replied, "I appreciate you sharing your thoughts." That was all I said. I did not reveal anything. I did not correct his assumptions. I simply allowed the conversation to end. On my way home, I thought about how interesting human behavior can be. When people believe they have the advantage, they often become more comfortable showing their true beliefs. Michael and Laura were not just negotiating a rental agreement. They were showing me how they viewed someone they considered less powerful. They had never asked about my background. They had never wondered about my experience. They had only looked at my age and created their own story. But their story was completely wrong. The truth was that I had spent decades making responsible financial decisions. My husband and I had built our future carefully. We had invested in properties, planned for retirement, and prepared for the unexpected. The house they were discussing was not something I inherited or received by accident. It represented years of effort and thoughtful choices. That evening, I opened an old photo album from the early days when we first purchased the property. I found pictures of my husband standing in the backyard, smiling proudly as we worked on improvements together. We did not have everything at once. We built our life slowly. Every room, every change, and every improvement represented a decision we made together. Looking at those photos reminded me why I had been so careful throughout this process. The house was valuable because of its financial worth, but also because of the memories attached to it. I wanted people living there who understood that a home deserves respect. A few days later, I received a call from my attorney. He told me everything was ready whenever I decided to move forward. He reminded me that I had the final authority over every decision involving the property. I thanked him and told him I appreciated his help. After hanging up, I sat quietly and thought about what would happen when Michael and Laura finally learned the truth. Part of me wondered how they would react. Would they feel embarrassed? Would they apologize? Would they finally understand that they had judged me too quickly? I did not know the answer, but I knew one thing. I was not looking for revenge. I did not want to make them feel small. I simply wanted them to understand something important. Respect should never depend on how much power you think someone has. Respect should be given because every person deserves it. And soon, The moment would arrive when Michael and Laura would see the complete picture. They would finally learn that the quiet woman they believed they could negotiate with was the one person who had been in control all along. The moment I had been waiting for did not arrive with an argument or a dramatic confrontation. It arrived quietly, just as I expected. After years of experience, I had learned that the most important moments in life are often not the loudest ones. They happen in simple conversations, in unexpected meetings, and in the moments when people finally see the truth they had overlooked. A few days after my last conversation with Michael and Laura, I received a message asking me to attend a meeting about the property. They explained that they wanted to finalize everything and make sure everyone was clear about the future arrangement. I agreed. I knew this was the moment when everything would finally become clear. When I arrived, Michael and Laura were already there. They looked comfortable and confident. They greeted me politely, but I could sense that they still viewed the situation the same way they always had. They believed they were discussing terms with a quiet older woman who simply wanted to avoid complications. They had no idea that the entire conversation was about to change their understanding of the situation. We sat down together, and they began reviewing the points they had prepared. They talked about the rent amount, the responsibilities they expected, and the changes they wanted to make. I listened carefully, just as I had done from the beginning. When they finished, I thanked them for explaining their thoughts. Then I placed a folder on the table. It contained the official documents related to the property. Michael glanced at it without much interest at first. Then he opened the folder and started reading. I watched his expression change as he realized something he had never considered. The person sitting across from him was not simply an older woman trying to rent out a house. I was the owner. I was the person who had the final authority over every decision involving the property. The room became quiet. For the first time since we had met, Michael and Laura seemed unsure of what to say. The confidence they had carried during every previous conversation disappeared. They looked at the documents again, as if they were trying to understand how they had missed something so important. I did not feel satisfaction from their surprise. I did not feel the need to prove that I had been right all along. Instead, I felt something different. I felt disappointed that they had never taken the time to truly know me. I want you to understand something, I said calmly. The issue was never the amount of rent. It was never about whether you paid $800 or another amount. The issue was how you treated me when you believed I had less power than you. Michael looked down. Laura remained quiet. I continued explaining that I had welcomed them because I wanted someone who respected the home. I wanted people who understood that a relationship between a landlord and tenant should be based on honesty and respect. I did not expect anyone to treat me differently because of my financial situation. I expected them to treat me with basic consideration because I was a person. That was something they had forgotten. After a few moments, Michael finally spoke. He admitted that he had made assumptions about me. He said he thought he was helping someone who needed the arrangement more than he did. He acknowledged that he had not considered my experience or my perspective. Laura also apologized. She said she had focused too much on what they wanted and not enough on the trust one had given them. I appreciated their honesty, but I also understood that apologies do not erase everything immediately. Respect is something built through actions over time. As I left the meeting that day, I thought about how different everything could have been if they had simply taken the time to see me as a person from the beginning. They had judged me based on my age, my quiet nature, and their own assumptions. They never imagined that the woman they underestimated had spent a lifetime making thoughtful decisions and building a secure future. The truth had finally been revealed, but the greatest lesson was not that I had more power than they thought. The greatest lesson was that every person deserves respect before anyone knows their title, their possessions, or their influence. A person's value should never depend on what others think they have. It should come from who they are. After the meeting ended, I drove home feeling a mixture of emotions that was difficult to describe. For weeks, I had imagined the moment when Michael and Laura would finally understand the truth. I thought perhaps I would feel proud or relieved when they discovered that I was not the person they believed me to be. But as I drove through the familiar streets near my home in Columbus, Ohio, I realized something important. The greatest victory was not proving them wrong. The greatest victory was knowing that I had remained true to myself throughout the entire situation. I had not allowed their assumptions to change the way I treated them. I had chosen patience instead of anger and wisdom instead of frustration. That mattered more to me than anything else. Over the next several weeks, I noticed a clear difference in the way Michael and Laura communicated with me. They were more thoughtful with their words. They asked questions instead of making assumptions. They listened when I shared my concerns. It was a small change, but I noticed it. I understood that people do not always realize the impact of their actions until they see things from another perspective. One afternoon, Michael asked if he could speak with me privately. When we met, he seemed different from the confident person I had first encountered. He seemed more reflective and willing to admit his mistakes. He told me that he had spent time thinking about our conversations and realized that he had judged me before knowing anything about my life. He admitted that he saw my age and assumed I would not understand business decisions or property matters. He said he was embarrassed that he had underestimated someone who had worked so hard and gained so much experience over the years. I listened carefully. I appreciated his honesty because admitting a mistake requires humility. I told him that everyone makes assumptions sometimes. What matters is whether we are willing to recognize them and grow from them. I did not want him to feel ashamed forever. I wanted him to understand the lesson. Respect should never be something we offer only after learning someone's importance. It should be something we give from the beginning. Later, Laura also spoke with me. She apologized for the way she had approached our conversations. She explained that she had been focused on finding the best arrangement for herself and Michael, but she had not considered how her words might make me feel. She admitted that she treated me differently because she thought I was someone who would simply accept whatever they suggested. Hearing that honesty meant something to me, not because it changed the past, but because it showed that people can learn when they are willing to look honestly at their actions. I never wanted Michael and Laura to fear me. I never wanted them to think I used my position as the property owner to make them feel small. That was never my goal. I wanted them to understand that kindness and strength can exist together. Being generous does not mean being unaware. Being patient does not mean being powerless. Throughout my life, I had seen many people confuse quietness with weakness. They assumed that someone who does not speak loudly does not have confidence. But I had learned that true confidence does not need constant attention. It does not need to announce itself. It simply exists. The experience changed something in all of us. Michael and Laura learned to look beyond appearances. They learned that someone's age does not determine their intelligence or ability. I learned that even after a lifetime of experiences, people can still surprise you. Sometimes disappointment can lead to understanding. Sometimes difficult moments can reveal important lessons. As time passed, the relationship between us became more respectful. We were not perfect, and I did not forget what happened, but I believed in giving people the opportunity to become better. That was something my husband had always believed. He used to say that the measure of a person was not whether they made mistakes. It was whether they had the courage to correct them. Looking back, I realized the house had taught all of us something. It was never just about ownership, money, or a rental agreement. It was about seeing people clearly. It was about remembering that every person has a story that others may never know. And sometimes, the person who appears the least powerful may be the person who has the greatest strength. After everything that happened with Michael and Laura, I found myself thinking about the true meaning of ownership. For many years, I believed that owning a house meant having a place to live, a place to make memories, and a place to call home. But that experience taught me something deeper. A home is not defined only by the person whose name appears on the documents. It is also defined by the way people treat one another within those walls. The house my husband and I built together had always represented love, patience, and commitment. After he passed away, I wondered if it would ever feel the same again. But watching this situation unfold reminded me that the values we create in life can continue long after circumstances change. One morning, I sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee and looked at the garden my husband had planted years earlier. The flowers were beginning to bloom, and for a moment, I felt a sense of peace. I thought about how different things could have been if I had reacted with anger when Michael and Laura first approached me. I could have immediately shown them every document and explained everything they had misunderstood. But I realized that would not have changed their perspective. They needed to discover the lesson themselves. People often learn more from moments of reflection than from moments of correction. Over time, Michael and Laura became much more considerate. They started asking about my thoughts instead of assuming they already knew the answers. They began to understand that experience is something earned over a lifetime. It cannot be measured by age, appearance, or the way someone chooses to speak. One afternoon, Michael stopped by to help with a small maintenance issue at the house. As we stood outside near the garden, he looked around and said something that stayed with me. He said he finally understood why the house meant so much to me. Before, he had only seen a property. Now he saw a story. That simple change in perspective meant more than any apology could have. He realized that every home has a history, and every person connected to that home carries experiences that deserve respect. I told him that everyone has moments when they are wrong. The important thing is what they do after. Recognizing their mistake. Life gives us opportunities to become better versions of ourselves if we are willing to learn. Later that week, Laura brought over a small gift as a gesture of appreciation. She told me that meeting me had changed the way she viewed older people. She admitted that she had sometimes assumed older adults needed help instead of recognizing that they often had decades of knowledge to share. I smiled because that was the lesson I hoped they would understand. Age does not take away someone's value. In many ways, it adds to it. Every challenge, every success, and every difficult season creates wisdom that cannot be bought. Looking back, I realized that the situation had started with something simple. It began with a conversation about $800 and a rental agreement. But it became something much bigger. It became a lesson about assumptions, respect, and the importance of seeing people beyond what appears on the surface. Michael and Laura thought they understood my situation because they only saw one small part of my life. They did not see the years of work, the decisions, the memories, and the experiences that shaped me. They only saw what was visible. But people are always more than what others can immediately see. That is something I have carried with me throughout my life. We never truly know the complete story of another person. We do not know the challenges they overcame, the sacrifices they made, or the lessons they learned along the way. The woman they first met was quiet because she was thoughtful, not because she lacked confidence. She was patient because she understood life, not because she had no choices. And she stayed calm because she knew her worth did not depend on whether others recognized it. The house remained standing, the garden continued growing, and life moved forward. But the greatest change was not in the property itself. It was in the understanding that grew between people who once misunderstood each other. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from unexpected situations. Sometimes the moments when we feel underestimated reveal the strength we have carried all along. Years have passed since the day Michael and Laura first walked into my home believing they understood exactly who I was. When I look back now, I realize that moment was never really about a rental agreement or a monthly payment. It was about something much more important. It was about the way people see each other and the assumptions we sometimes make before knowing the full story. I have learned that life has a way of revealing the truth at the right time. We do not always need to defend ourselves when others misunderstand us. Sometimes, the best response is simply to continue living with honesty and dignity. The truth eventually finds its way forward. The house outside Columbus, Ohio, still stands today. The same walls that once held decades of memories with my husband continue to hold new moments. The garden he planted still grows, reminding me that the things we build with care can continue bringing beauty long after circumstances change. When I walk through those rooms, I no longer think about the difficult conversations or the moments when I felt underestimated. Instead, I think about the lessons that came from them. I think about how important it is to never judge someone based only on what you can see. Michael and Laura entered my life thinking they knew everything about me. They saw an older woman with a quiet voice and assumed I lacked confidence. They saw someone who was willing to listen and assumed I was easy to influence. But they never saw the years behind that silence. They never saw the challenges I overcame, the decisions I made, and the experiences that shaped who I became. That was the part they missed. A person is never just what appears on the surface. Everyone carries a story. Everyone has moments of struggle, moments of success, and lessons learned along the way. After everything happened, I started receiving more respect from Michael and Laura, but the greatest change was not in how they treated me. The greatest change was in how they understood people. They learned that kindness does not mean weakness. They learned that age does not reduce someone's value. They learned that the person who speaks the least can sometimes have the greatest understanding. Those lessons were worth more than any apology. I also learned something about myself. For a long time, I believed that being a good person meant always giving others the benefit of the doubt. I still believe in kindness, but I also understand that kindness must exist alongside self-respect. We can be generous while still protecting what matters. We can forgive while still remembering the lessons we have learned. We can remain calm without allowing others to mistake our calmness for helplessness. My husband always believed that a person's true character was revealed through how they treated people who could not offer them anything in return. Those words stayed with me throughout this experience. They reminded me that respect should never depend on someone's financial situation, age, or position. It should be given because every person deserves to be treated with dignity. Looking back, I am grateful that I handled the situation the way I did. Not because I proved that I had more power than Michael and Laura expected. Not because I surprised them with information they never imagined. I am grateful because I stayed true to myself. I did not allow someone else's assumptions to change my values. I did not let disappointment turn into bitterness. Instead, I chose patience, understanding, and grace. The biggest lesson from this experience is simple. Never underestimate someone because of what you think you know about them. The quiet person sitting across from you may have a lifetime of wisdom you have never seen. The person you think has nothing to offer may have built more than you could imagine. And the person you believe is powerless may simply be choosing not to show their strength until the moment truly matters. Life is full of unexpected lessons. Sometimes they come through difficult conversations. Sometimes they come through people who enter our lives and challenge the way we think. But every experience has the potential to teach us something valuable. Today, I still walk through my home with gratitude. I still enjoy my garden, my memories, and the peaceful life I built. And whenever I think about that chapter, I remember one important truth. A person's worth is never determined by what others assume about them. True value comes from within, and no one can take that away.